Good afternoon, everybody. Going to get started in just a couple of minutes. Thank you for being on time. Thank you for being early and ready. Going to get started in about 3 minutes. We're about 3 minutes to start. Good morning, everybody. Morning, afternoon. Don't know what I'm doing there. We will get started in just a couple of minutes, about a little less than 3 minutes till we start. Make sure you get your note page ready to go. Make sure you've hit present already on Teams and in Zoom, and we're going to get started very shortly. Have a lot to cover. No, we don't have too much to cover. I think we got this. We can handle this. Today's topic, finishing out Reconstruction for the most part. There is a do now today, not unlike before. So have ready what Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was. Give me some specific details. Don't type them in yet, but have it ready because I want to see us going over this. Have ready also what was the Freedmen's Bureau? And then why didn't Lincoln's plan succeed? So have those answers ready to go. And when I start the clock, you're going to be needing to fill those in. So we're going to talk about that. What was Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction? Just describe it. Thank you for letting me know. Your Wi-Fi is messing up. So make sure you have that idea. What were parts of his plan? You don't have to give me the whole thing, right? It doesn't have to be every little piece. But you should be able to remember a couple of key points from Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. So make sure you have that in mind. Try to remember Freedmen's Bureau. If you don't remember it, look back in your notes, look through them really quick because that's something we need. You're going to need that for today's topic because we're going to finish out Reconstruction. At least we're going to try to. About a minute before we start. Actually, a little less than a minute. All right. So it's not quite yet. It is almost time. Again, make sure you got your note page ready to go. Make sure you've looked through your old notes if you need to be able to remember some details of Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction. What was the Freedmen's Bureau? Explain what they did. And then why didn't Lincoln's Reconstruction plan succeed? There's really only one reason why, but if you can find other ones, I'd love to hear. So 2.5 minutes, that is on the clock. Go ahead and get started with your notes page if you haven't already. And more importantly, privately, start sending me answers to those do nows. You don't have to number them. I'll wait, send them just in one chunk. Like, Lincoln's plan, Freedmen's Bureau. Why didn't Lincoln's plan succeed? So I'm going to give you 3 minutes to make sure that we have time to get those answers in. So if you're just getting in, privately, I'm already getting some responses. Thank you to those that are already ready to go. Send me answers to those 3 do now questions. They're really easy. It's really brief. It doesn't need to be a whole explanation. This isn't an SAQ. This is more just to try to remember. What's Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction like? What did the Freedmen's Bureau do? Or explain what they were like, what were their contributions? And then why doesn't Lincoln's plan succeed? I'll be reading responses. You have about 2.5 minutes till we get into the topic today. So these are all from yesterday's notes. So if you took good notes yesterday, you should have these. Lincoln's plan's in the very beginning. Freedmen's Bureau is near the end. And the why didn't Lincoln's plan succeed is more or less in the middle. Seeing some really good responses. 10%, that's good. That's what you need. 10% plan, right? That's what it was called. 10% of the population. Should see some more than that. I got a few good responses in. Remember, get your responses in. You got about 2 minutes. A little less than 2 minutes, I should say. I've seen some good responses for Freedmen's Bureau. Seen a few close but not quite on the money. I saw one close but not quite on the money response to the first one. I'm gonna give you the full answers, or at least more or less where you should be at, because a lot of us are really good, a lot of us are really close. Some of us are just pulling straight from the notes, which is fine, but try to put it in your own words. About a minute left on the clock. Remember, try to get that response in so that way you get credit for it when I go through these a little later. 30 seconds. If we move on and you haven't answered, but you want to get your answer in, put it in as we're moving through. That's fine. 30 seconds on the clock. About 20 seconds and we're going to go over this. Again, if you didn't get your response and you need to get it in. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on that explanation. If you did not respond to this, try to get something in there. So some of us said they didn't remember. Some of us said that Lincoln's plan was about just letting the South in. But specifically, what makes Lincoln's plan different from somebody else's? Does Lincoln want to forgive everybody and let them in right away? Yes or no? You can shout it out or you can type it out. Yes or no? Does Lincoln want to quickly let everybody back in and forgive them? Yes or no? And I mean everybody. No, right? He wants to punish significant Confederate members, right? So like high-ranking people, people that worked in the government, maybe some of the generals. He doesn't want to punish everybody, but he wants to punish the Confederacy. And there's a number. Who remembers the number? A couple of people put it in their responses. What's the number? Put it public in chat. The number of people that have to swear loyalty to the Union and accept the new government. There's a specific number in Lincoln's plan, 10%. No, it's percentage, Eric. So yeah, 10% of voters, right? 10% of voters have to agree to join the Union. And once they do that, they're in. It's not just a promise, 10% have to pledge, right? And it's not everybody. He doesn't let Confederates in. So that's Lincoln's plan. Freedmen's Bureau, pretty much everybody that responded to that one got it, right? They're there to help. Food, education, clothing, land, all sorts of things help, right? They're there to help everybody. Why don't Lincoln's plan succeed? It's pretty self-explanatory, right? He caught a bullet, couldn't carry out the plan. Johnson, his replacement, didn't have the same beliefs Lincoln did. So good job, guys. Thank you for those that are responding. It will show up on your grades in the grade book and all that good stuff. So let's get started. We're talking about phase 2 of Reconstruction. So phase 1 is that early plan, right? That 10% plan, the pre-plan. But Lincoln dies. His replacement, Andrew Johnson, we've talked about him. He's not the greatest president. He's one of the first ones to be impeached. He very much is a racist, and not like a traditional 1800s, like kind of racist person. Like he's a racist. He's a real racist, if you could say. So he's not a big fan of some of the reasons we fought the Civil War for. He's also not a fan of wealthy landowners in the South, even though he's a Southern Democrat. He's more of a Jacksonian Democrat. So his Reconstruction plan, he pardons everybody if they just say, I promise to be, loyal to the Union. Okay. That's it. If you say it, he pardons you. He's not strict on anybody. He does not pardon Confederate leaders that owned more than $20,000 of taxable property. What does this mean? So I'm going to give you what you can put in really, really layman's terms. If you're a Confederate leader, but you are super, 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 super wealthy, he didn't pardon you. So very, very few Confederate leaders got didn't get pardoned, essentially. Because you had to be really wealthy. You had to not only be a Confederate leader, but you had to also be a really wealthy planter, like the top of the rich scale, not just a planter, like the top of the planter scale. He admitted Confederate states and appointed governors who established voting procedures for state legislatures. Basically, he picked a governor and then he admitted the states back in. So he let pretty much every Confederate state back in really, really, really quickly. States had to abolish slavery. And I have air quotes in that for a good reason. We'll get into that in a second. And secession clauses from the state constitutions. Basically, all a state had to do, and I'm going to put, you can put it like this. You don't have to word it the way it is on the slides. You can word it in this basic sense, right? Johnson's Reconstruction plan, all it requires is a promise of loyalty, the abolition of slavery, and secession clauses from the Constitution, and that's it. He pardoned almost every Confederate. He let pretty much everybody back in, and he picked the governors himself. Now, he's a Southern Jacksonian-style Democrat. Who do you think he's going to pick to govern these states? What type of politician is he? Is he going to pick like Republican politicians, the ones that are from this time that are Northern, that maybe have different? No, he's going to pick other Southern Democrats, right? And because he's picking other Southern Democrats, let me ask you this. And I don't like to make this political, but you have to for this point specifically. Prior to being Confederates, prior to leaving the Union, what party were all of these politicians from all these states? They were Southern, and they were what? Somebody type it, somebody shout it. Whichever one. What party did these guys, all these Confederate leaders belong to? What party did all these Confederate leaders belong to? Somebody needs to say it. Democrats. Yeah, they're Democrats. They're Southern Democrats, right? The Jacksonian Democrats, all those old school Johnson types are Confederates. There's no radical Republicans that are Confederates. You know what I mean? There's no Northern abolitionists that were Confederates. So when Johnson picks other Southern Democrats to run these states, he's essentially letting them go back to what they were before they seceded. And he's letting them back into the Union really quickly. It's a really, really weak form of Reconstruction. He quickly lets in the states, and basically the states all re-elect former Confederate officials. So like people that were in charge during the Confederacy are now in charge of these states again. Who's this going to affect? Who's this going to hurt, I should say, the most? Who is this going to really, really hurt in the South? Well, they're not slaves anymore, right? But former slaves. These recently freed African Americans now have to deal with the government that would have rather they'd stayed enslaved, being in charge again. This is the plan that goes into effect post-war, right? Because the phase one, Lincoln's plan, it was a game plan. But when Lincoln goes, Johnson changes it and he makes it weaker. So if Lincoln's plan seemed good, sturdy, right? Firm but not too firm, right? Like strict but not too mean. Johnson's plan is what? If Lincoln's plan seems fair but firm, like a boxing ref, what's Johnson's plan? Is it strong or is it weak towards the South? What do you think? It's weak, right? And it is going to negatively impact recently freed slaves. It is going to negatively impact any type of Northerner that lives in the South. Whether you be white, whether you be a recently freed slave, it's going to hurt poor whites as well, because poor whites are going to be right back on the bottom where they were before. It's not so much that he reverses Lincoln's work. It's that Lincoln didn't get to start his work, and this guy kind of saw the plan and changed it because he was he had sympathies towards the South. So he doesn't undo Lincoln's work, but a lot of what's going to happen here will undo a lot of the work that some of the Union generals did. We're going to talk about it. We're going to get into what changes later. So I've been talking a lot, and the slide's been up the whole time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put about 1.5 minutes on the clock. And do me a favor, if you're done with notes here, let me know. And if you need more time, let me know. No mercy. we're going to get to the no mercy stuff. So if you're good, if you're done, please just put done in the chat so I know that we're done. But I will put a minute and a half if you do need time, just so I can kind of see where we're at with notes. Thank you, guys. But yes, so Johnson's plan, phase 2, Andrew Johnson's plan, really weak to the Confederacy. Really, really weak. It's going to lead to some rather horrendous things that we're going to talk about next. Has anybody heard of the term black codes? Anybody heard of those? Maybe just in passing, but you don't really know what they are. That's fine too. Has anybody heard of black codes? Yeah, no, maybe so. Not blackmail, black codes. Think so. Okay, so we're going to get into those next. They are pretty horrendous. So I'm going to go to move on. It seems like we're done. So if you need time on this, slides should already be up on Google, and I can always go back to that if you need a little more time. But we're going to go ahead and move forward. So black codes. Before you write anything down, don't write anything yet. Not really. Black codes. Basically, pre-Civil War, in the United States, but especially in the southern United States, there were rules to what slaves could and couldn't do, right? Guidelines that they followed. And those were called slave codes. The black codes, I am not kidding. And you can look these up. And I think Crash Course, what the Reconstruction video, when they do the document in Crash Course, he reads a black code. It's literally the slave codes, but they took out the word slave and replaced it with the word Negro, with the word black. That's the same laws that they made the slaves follow, only they didn't refer to the people as slaves. Those were black codes. And those laws were put into place by these former Confederate states that were allowed back into the Union because whose fault are these things? Because these happened. These were on the books in almost every single Confederate state except maybe Tennessee. Why? What happened that messed up the plan that was supposed to fix all this? So it's not, don't necessarily, so yes, it's the Southern Jacksonian style Democrats, but it's specifically who? Johnson, right? Johnson's plan hurts everybody in a sense because he lets the people run the states the way they did before. So they were free. So yeah, so they were freed men, like in quote. That's why I said in quotes, right? They abolished slavery in quotes, but not really. They had to walk around with permits from their employers. They couldn't be out at night without permits from their employers. They couldn't. It's another good one that they had. They couldn't. I believe they couldn't own land in some of them. There's all sorts of strict codes that were in place. And these are laws. And they greatly impacted these recently freed slaves. And it was really negative. And it was because Johnson's plan for Reconstruction is so weak that the old Confederates, right? We don't necessarily have to call them like Southern Democrats. We can call them Confederates, are able to just get back in power and run the state the way they want to. It limits economic opportunities for blacks, like super severely. Basically hurting at their chances to make money. You don't need to write it all. So what do you need? You need the first 2 points. You need that they're based on slave codes and that they're made to limit economic opportunity. For provisions, you don't need to write all of this, but I would include little pieces of it, whether it's labor contracts, whether it's they could only work as a farmer or a servant unless they paid taxes for it. You need to pick like 1 or 2 of those things and include them as examples of what a black code was. Provisions means like parts. Provisions are like some of the specific laws that were in place. Those are provisions. It's like the provisions of the black code, some of them where you had to sign a contract to work. Some of them where you weren't allowed to work as anything other than a farmer if you paid, unless you paid taxes. You couldn't move around. You couldn't go out at nights. You couldn't have certain types of property. Those are provisions. Those are examples of laws. So you need the first 2 bullet points. You need to include at least 1 or 2 examples of these laws. And then all you would need to put is that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 overturns black codes. Johnson vetoes that bill, but Congress overrides his veto. And we'll get into all that coming up onto how that came to be, how Congress was so strong that they could override the president's veto. Because it's something they can do, but they had never done it till this point. And there's going to be a pretty good reason for it. So if Johnson's veto hadn't been overturned, there's a very good chance you could very much have near slavery to this day, because Congress was able to get the power to overturn his veto. Not just that they're built different, but they also there were circumstances that gave them a supermajority. So for the next 2 years, Congress will have, the radical Republicans specifically, will have a supermajority in Congress, and they'll be able to overrun a veto, because you need a 2/3 vote to override a veto. You can do it, but you need a 2/3 vote. So it's very rare that you're going to get 2/3 of Congress to agree to anything nowadays. And it was even, to be fair, it was even rare back then, but radical Republicans will have a 2/3 majority. And it'll lead to a different type of Reconstruction after they oust Johnson. So another 45 seconds or so. If you need more time than that, let me know. Then we're going to move on. About 20 seconds, 25 seconds. So remember, black codes are basically slave laws that stayed on the books in Confederate, and you can put in parentheses if you want, Democrat-controlled southern states during Johnson's era of Reconstruction, which is barely Reconstruction. It's just more like a reverse button or a rewind button or something. It's crazy. All right, let's go to move forward. You don't need to write much here other than know that in the midterm elections of 1866, radical Republicans obtain a supermajority in the House and in the Senate. I would include these numbers so you get an idea of what that means. So a supermajority is when you have way more than just the majority. So like, for example, in the Senate now, a majority is 51. Back then, a majority was 34. But in the Senate, radical Republicans had 39 members. In the House, you needed 113 for majority. They had 175. So what do you need for this slide? Again, the midterm elections of 1866, radical Republicans obtained a supermajority in the House and in the Senate. I have no idea what you're referencing. Isn't that like a Marvel villain, Galactus? So about a quick 45 seconds. We don't need that much time. Again, radical Republicans gain a supermajority in 1866 in their midterm elections. Fortnite. Oh, that makes sense. Yeah, I have no idea about Fortnite. Not a battle royale person. Not into that. All right, let's go to move forward. So before we write everything, this is a lot. This is the third phase of Reconstruction, and it's got two names. Congressional Reconstruction. Actually, it's got three names. Congressional Reconstruction, Radical Reconstruction. Need more time? Okay. Give you a quick little bit of time, and then we'll move forward to that next one. And again, don't write everything for that next one because that's a huge chunk of information. Do about 20 more seconds. Remember, do not write everything on the next slide. All right. Getting ready to move on. All right. So the third phase of Reconstruction has three names. It's called Congressional Reconstruction, it's called Radical Reconstruction, and it's also called Military Reconstruction. So you might want to include all three names. Include all three names. You can just put them all in parentheses, right? Congressional, Radical, Military. It's the same thing, it's the same era. And it took place from 1867 to 68. And what happens are that a lot of the former Confederates states, in fact, every single one of them, except for Tennessee, refuses to ratify the 14th Amendment. They refuse to vote for it. Who remembers what the 14th Amendment does? Somebody type it out in the chat or shout it out in person. Makes everybody citizens, right? If you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen, especially, specifically, African Americans. So, good answer. Right? Free citizens vote. Always remember that. 13th freed the slaves. 14th made everybody citizens. 15th makes all citizens vote, male citizens. What are the names again? Free citizens vote, 13, 14, 15. Freed the slaves, citizens, and then suffrage to all citizens. We'll spend a little more time on them in a second. But so, all these Confederates refuse to ratify the 14th Amendment. So, all of the former Confederate states are now placed under military control. Congress will send soldiers and they will establish military districts, right? You see right here, District 4, District 5, 3, 2, and then District 1's Virginia. The military will enforce martial law. They will protect blacks. They will supervise elections that are free and true. They will protect office holders. They will ensure that everybody is registered and is able to vote. This includes poor whites. This includes freed blacks. This includes former slaves. Everybody that should be voting, the military makes sure that they're registered and is able to vote. And the military makes sure that it is safe. While the military is there, former Confederates get removed from government until Congress lets them in. Now Congress is controlled by radical Republicans. The chance of them getting in is very slim. They have to be truly like, I have changed my ways to even be considered by a lot of the people in charge now. What do these states have to do? Well, they have to create new constitutions. They have to make new rule books, right? Congress has to approve that constitution, and the state constitutions must include addendums to black suffrage, which means they have to let black people vote, and they must ratify the 14th Amendment. So what do we think about this? So if Lincoln was fair but firm, if Johnson's was too weak, what is this? Is this maybe too strong? Maybe? Could you see why this is too strong? The military in charge of all these states? Maybe? No? What do you think? There's no right or wrong answer. I'm just curious. Like, is this too much? The military controlling these states until they fix it. What do you think? So while you're doing that, what to write here? What do you need? Well, you don't need all of this. I've been saying that the whole time. You need to point out right here, former Confederate states were placed under Army control and put in military districts. The military enforced martial law, and you can stop right there. If you want to include what they did, you can do that. They excluded former Confederates. That's important. Point that out. The states had to recreate their constitutions, governments, and had to ratify the 14th Amendment. That's what you need. Right? So you don't need everything word per word. You need to know what the states had to do. You need to know what the Army did, and you need to know that the Army took control. I would also include the dates, 67 to 68. So I'll give you about 2 minutes for that. So I think this is something where by this point, Johnson's government, right, and the government set up in 65, 67, all those areas, had messed this up so much that you had to do this. I think it is too strict, right? I think this is definitely an overuse of federal power, you could argue. But I think they had to do it. I think it's one of those things where the people in there probably weren't happy about it. But looking back on it, I think this is probably one of the better. This is the high note of Reconstruction. This is it working. It's sad that the only way it worked was when the army was there threatening everybody. And when I say threatening, I mean by presence, right? The army's presence there made everybody calm down. It's not that they weren't like doing anything violent. They weren't acting like redcoats in Boston. I'm not trying to make that sound like that. But just the presence of the military made all of these other people chill out. And it's sad that that had to happen, but I do think it's something that was an overuse of power, but a necessary one. Because by this point in time, it had been messed up so much that you had former Confederate governments essentially refusing to acknowledge the law of the land, right? Refusing to let African Americans run around freely, refusing to ratify the 14th Amendment. And so, yes, this excluded former Confederates. This took them out of office and made them have to be approved by Congress. They couldn't even vote, I think, under this, but the military wouldn't let them vote. They weren't eligible. They lost their eligibility until Congress let them vote again. Kind of like what Lincoln wanted, right? Remember, Lincoln's whole thing was, hey, if you were a high-ranking Confederate, you can't vote. Or if you were a Confederate, you can't vote. Sorry, that was his thing. So, again, about 2 minutes. Shouldn't be more than that. Again, this phase is called Radical Reconstruction, Congressional Reconstruction, and Military Reconstruction. But during this time, it's kind of working. This is where Reconstruction starts to work. What do you think? And when you get a chance, just tell me what you think's going to happen. What's going to go wrong? Put in the chat privately. What do you think's going to go wrong? Remember, Johnson gets impeached, and by this point, a little later on, you're going to get somebody else in charge. Somebody that's going to beat him out. You're going to get a new president that is very much in favor of a lot of this stuff because it's what he fought for. Oops, spoilers. That's a good guess. No, they're not going to overturn it. It's going to be a mixture of two things, and I'll get into it at the end of why this doesn't last. Because I would argue that this era in time, as far as equality goes, is one of the more equal and more represented times in the Union, especially pre-civil rights movement, let's say, right? There's no Jim Crow. This is a weird little era where there is no Jim Crow. It's not that there isn't racism, but that racism isn't affecting people's rights, their individual rights. It's not affecting their it's not affecting their piece of the America pie. They're still getting their liberty. They're still getting their right to vote. They're still getting all of these things, even if Farmer Joe's a jerk because he's racist, right? It's not affecting people's rights during this time period. Jim Crow and all these things are going to mess that up. No, the intelligence test, the literacy test, the grandfather clauses, all those things that are meant to limit voting happen after this. They don't happen during this time. That's my point, right? During this time, it's fair. During this time, you're going to see African Americans elected to Congress. You're going to see a lot of radical and not radical Republicans holding office in southern states because those are the people that fought the Civil War on behalf of slavery. You're going to see a lot of those things. You're going to see a lot of. It seems weird when you look back at the history of the South and you look back at what will be like the civil rights movement and things like, why was there a civil rights movement if everything seems to be going so well? Well, we're going to get into why. So let's move forward. If you need more time than this, I'm going to give you a couple more seconds, grab a picture of it, look it up on the Google Classroom because we're going to move on because we're running low on time. Key point 2. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted African-American citizenship, equal protection under the laws, and voting rights. So I'd get that down. Those are the 3 amendments you need, right? Free citizens and vote. 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th gave them citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th gave them the right to vote. So that time, military reconstruction, the army's there, making their presence known, enforcing the laws, but the laws are working the way they should be. But something's going to happen, and we'll get into it in a bit. We'll get into it a little bit, and we'll get more into it tomorrow when we talk about the failures of Reconstruction, because this is a big fat failure. This whole idea doesn't really work. It almost works. It looks like maybe it could work. It looks really cool when you look back on what it was like, and it's going to fail. And we'll get into why soon. So let's get that key point down. I'll give you another minute, and then we will get into a couple of things. These next ones move kind of quickly. So be careful with writing. Again, you're not going to write everything word per word on the next couple of slides. About 30 seconds. Get ready. We're going to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1866 coming up next. About 20 seconds. More time. Okay, we'll do another 30 more seconds from here. So again, military Reconstruction was from 67 to 68. So now we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Act that Johnson vetoed, but that Congress overturned the veto for, and it was able to get into effect. So let's go ahead and move forward. So again, don't write this word per word. You're not going to need most of this. Civil Rights Act of 1866. It makes everybody that was born or naturalized in the United States citizens of the United States. Privileges and immunities. No state can make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens. Due process. No state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, property without due process of the law. Equal protection. No state can deny any person equal protection under the law. This act is designed to protect everybody's constitutional rights. It's a really good idea. It's basically telling the states, hey, you can't infringe on somebody's rights just because you want to, just because you don't like them, just because they're a different race, just because they're this, just because they're that. It's the goal. It's the Equality Act. It should have worked, but it's not going to. You do not need to write every single definition here. What do you need to know? You need to know the name, and you need to know what it did, right? What did it do? It defended the rights of individuals. Specifically, it specifically calls out states. It says, hey, states, you can't take away people's rights. I know what you're thinking. Isn't that a little redundant? Kind of, but it had to be, right? So it specifically says, hey, somebody's a citizen, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do that. So you don't write it word per word. You just need to know what it did. Best rule of thumb, I would say, is to just write down that it protects the privileges, rights, and protects everybody under the law. That's pretty much it. That's what it does. It makes sure every citizen is protected under the law. A state can't pick somebody and decide to do something that is not fair to them, which again sounds self-explanatory now in 2020, but it wasn't in 1866. It wasn't always the case. And when you read out what it did, that just tells you kind of how much of a racist Johnson was. Johnson was like, nah, I'm gonna veto that. And Congress was like, no, you're not. Because it was so widely accepted by the members of Congress. Even the moderate Republicans are like, why would you say no to that? It doesn't make sense, right? It's not even the radicals. It's like everybody's like, come on, man. So again, a quick minute on there. Johnson, it's not even that he's that crazy. It's just he's the wrong type of, he's literally like the last person you'd pick to replace Lincoln. It's weird. And he's not a Confederate. I mean, he wasn't. He was a wartime Democrat, like he was in the Union. But he's like, that's probably the only thing you could have done is worse, is you could have probably picked a Confederate and it would have been just as bad. You know what I mean? It's weird. It's like he's one step above Confederate, and he's the guy running the country right after you beat the Confederates. It's not like, again, this is all John Wilkes Booth's fault because 360 no scope messed everything up. But it's what it was. Like, I truly believe, and I'm not even the biggest like Lincoln fan. Like, my favorite president is Teddy Roosevelt, but Lincoln's the only guy that could have pulled off Reconstruction. And when they killed him, they killed the chance of this working correctly. And it's not going to work. And that's why there's going to need to be a Civil Rights Act. That's why you could argue there's still remnants of racism that date all the way back to this time in the U.S. today, especially in a lot of those old Confederate states. It's because of how bad this is going to fail. And we're going to talk about the failure tomorrow in more detail, but it'll make sense. So we're going to go ahead and move forward. Again, this was really short. You didn't need much on here. If you need something on it, if you wanted to write a little more, grab a picture of it really quick. I'm going to move forward. So you don't need to write anything here. 15th Amendment. The rights of citizens shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on the account of race, color, or previous conditions of servitude. It specifically says, just because they were a slave, doesn't matter the race, doesn't matter the color, they can vote. That's what this is. You can't take away their right to vote. Impeachment of Johnson. All you need to write here, he vetoed the Civil Rights Act, 10-year Office Act. House passed 11 impeachment articles. Basically, they found 11 things to impeach him on. And his trial went to the Senate. He barely missed getting thrown out instantly. Barely. He missed it by one vote. It was 35-19 in the Senate, and it needed to be 36. He missed it by one vote. So all you need to know here, Johnson was almost convicted in the Senate by one vote. He missed it by a vote. The Senate convicted him 35-19. They needed 36 to get him convicted. But he will go to trial for 3 of the 11 things that they found he did wrong. And we're not going to get into what those things are. You just got to know Johnson's the guy impeached. Everybody thinks that Nixon got impeached. Nixon never got impeached because the vice president pardoned him right away. So Nixon never got impeached. It's Andrew Johnson and it's Bill Clinton. Okay, so I'm going to move on in about 45 seconds. You don't need to, again, just know that he got impeached. He was accused of 11 things. He went to trial for 3, and he missed conviction by 1 vote. About 20 seconds. Okay, let's move forward. Next key point. The women's rights movement was both emboldened, right, which means they liked and they got stronger by, and they were also split and divided over the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. So the women's rights movement was emboldened, but divided on the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Anybody want to take a guess as to why during the minute and a half I give you to write that down? Anybody want to take a guess as to why the women's rights movement would be split? We know why they'd be emboldened, right? More people are getting the right to vote. Why would it split them? Why do you think? So about a minute and a half, if you can write that in, and then if you get a chance, you can send it privately. Why does this split the women's rights movement? Why are they divided on this? Why do you think they're divided, I should say? So not quite. In fact, the 14th and 15th Amendment do not give women the right to vote. Women won't get the right to vote till the 21st Amendment. So that's a good guess. But why do you think it's split women? Did I say 21st Amendment? I meant to say first. 19th. I don't know what I'm thinking. 1920. Maybe that's why I said 21st. So, don't write anything here. Don't write it yet. Don't write anything right now. Prior to the 14th and 15th Amendment, you had something called the American Equal Rights Association. Their goal was to secure rights to all American citizens, especially the right of suffrage. It didn't matter what race you were, what color you were, or what gender you were. They didn't care. They wanted everybody to have rights, especially the right to vote. Think about like the Seneca Falls Convention and all of these things we've been talking about. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Henry Blackwell, Frederick Douglass. These are all members of the American Equal Rights Association. So you need the name, American Equal Rights Association, AERA, 1866. Their goal is to give everybody rights, especially the right to vote. But after the 14th and 15th Amendment, you will get a different movement, one called the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869, that opposed and was against the 15th Amendment. Members like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed this movement. They had, I believe, the newspaper called The Revolution. Then you got another group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, that supported the 15th Amendment. Henry Blackwell and a couple of other, I believe Lucy Sloan was also a part of here. You have their newspaper, the Women's Journal. So what was one strong group with abolitionists and women's rights activists and everybody all in there splits in two. One opposes the 15th Amendment, one supports it. Why? Why would anybody oppose the 15th Amendment? People like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are awesome women who championed women's suffrage for years. Why are they against the 15th Amendment? Why do you think? Again, women won't get the right to vote till the 19th Amendment in 1920. They don't benefit. That's a good assumption, and you are right to an extent. So this is going to sound bad, and it's because it is. But I don't censor primary sources here, and I didn't include it on here, but I will show it to you tomorrow when we talk about the failures of Reconstruction. Very prominent figures, I believe Cady Stanton specifically, will say, you are giving the right to vote to 2 million black men when 15 million white women still can't vote. How dare you? She doesn't say how dare you, but it's the message behind what she's writing in this newspaper, The Revolution. In fact, I'm going to try to pull the quote up right now, but if I don't get to it, we are a little low on time. But so now if I tell you that, if I give you that quote from her, I'm going to pull it up right now. Why are some people in this former movement against the 15th Amendment? It's in part because they don't benefit. Who is benefiting instead of them? Who's benefiting instead of the white women? I got the quote. So what do you need? You need to know that it's split. You need to know this group opposed the 15th Amendment, and you know this group supported it. This was the group before it. That was just about free rights. So basically, the reason that a lot of women's rights activists are against, not, and a good number of them, again, I'm going to give you it's not Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony quote right now that is talking about how it's, I don't like trashing activists, so I'm not going to. But there's hints of racism in the argument. that you're letting black men vote before you're letting white women vote. It's kind of a nasty message. Doesn't help anybody. It's just tearing down what's happening because the African Americans are getting this right to vote, right? African American men specifically. And white women still can't vote. And that's her whole argument. And I'm going to show you the quote in a second because, so I will show it to you. And it's not a good one, but it is the one that she makes. So again, you need the three groups, the one before the amendment, how it was united for rights for everybody. Then the split, one that's against the 15th and one that is for it. I'll give you another quick minute, and then we're going to move on. You just need the names of the groups and what they did. Right? So the first group, equality. Second group, opposed the 15th Amendment. Third group, supported the 15th Amendment. That's all you needed. About 25 more seconds. We're almost done. In fact, I don't think we're going to, we're not going to have time. We're not going to get into, so tomorrow we're going to talk about what life was like in the South during Reconstruction. We're going to talk about what it was like, what the failures of Reconstruction were. But before we get there, I do have two more things to cover, two more slides. I'm going to talk about the Susan B. Anthony quote, and then I'm going to get into Grant. We're going to talk about Grant. So this is the quote I was talking about. So I'll give you a minute to read it. And the dominant party she's talking about is the Republican parties that are in charge of Congress. These are Susan B. Anthony's words. She's an awesome person. But remember, you can't judge historical figures by the standards of today. You got to put them in their own time period. I'm not trying to justify what she's saying because what she's saying is a little messed up. Not a little, a lot of messed up. But she has her reasons for saying it. It's very extreme. You don't need to write any of this. This is just what she's talking about. She's using race to get her message across. And it's a very strong message. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that, women shouldn't have the vote. They should have the vote. But I'm also saying, so what she's saying here, when the 15th Amendment gets announced and passed, she's arguing against it. What she's saying here is you're letting black men vote while forcing millions of white women to not vote, essentially, right? Like you dethrone them. You're doing this to your own sisters and wives and daughters and things like that. It's very extreme. She's saying that, how dare you? Basically, you can interpret it for yourselves. And if you disagree with me, message me on Teams, let me know. But when I read this, what I get and what I think a lot of people get, what a lot of historians get is you let black men vote before you let white women vote. And right, she's using the race card and she's saying, like, how dare you do that? It is. She would have been canceled, right? And I'm not saying cancel Susan B. Anthony. That's not what I'm saying. Right? That's the whole thing about history. That's why people it's like remember, I don't know if you remember, like in August, I showed you those tweets of people trying to cancel Genghis Khan because they realized he murdered a bunch of people. Like, not that Genghis Khan's a good guy, right? He's like the Hitler of the Middle Ages, but you can't judge people from in 1869 writing about race and voting by 2020 standards. Take her for what she was. This is a pretty racist thing to say. She's not a great person for saying it. That doesn't make her a bad person either. You shouldn't strike her out of the history books just because she was racist in 1869. Most people were. The people that weren't racist are like the cream of the crop, awesome, best people. Right? It's like the time machine. You put anybody from 2020 as a baby in a time machine, send them back to 1867, good chance they're going to end up racist. Like, it's not this 15th Amendment split up a lot of people. A lot of people that were on the same team, like Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass, will realize that they're not. Now, when I go back to those groups, some people like Lucretia Mott, who, if you remember, Lucretia Mott's a former slave, so is Frederick Douglass. They stayed in this group. Some people had the right idea. They fought the good fight. They kept it going. This isn't about anything. This is about, like, me getting votes doesn't mean you don't, right? That was a lot of Frederick Douglass's argument. And our exit ticket's going to have a really, really good Frederick Douglass quote. I'm actually kind of pumped for it. But yeah, it's just one of those things. And it's a really intense moment. And I said we were going to talk about Grant, but I lied because we were running low on time, and I want to get into the exit ticket because it's a bit of a doozy. So I'll leave you with that Susan B. Anthony quote, and let's talk about the exit ticket. So it's already up. Okay, does anybody not understand the split now? Yeah, because that's true. Maybe I said it confusing. There's a movement for rights for everybody that a lot of key members are in. A lot of white women, for example, supported abolition. A lot of abolitionists like Douglass and Harriet Tubman supported the women's rights movement and the women's suffrage movement. They're working on the same team. But then the 15th Amendment passes. And some of the women's rights activists, some of the white women in the women's rights activists got upset. And they split off and said, you're doing, like, they were against the 15th Amendment because they still couldn't vote. Yes, so basically when the 15th Amendment passes and black men can vote, but white women still can't, some of the more extreme supporters of women's rights split up. They broke apart, and they were like, they were against the 15th Amendment until white women could vote, essentially. And some, like Frederick Douglass, like Lucretia Mott, and some of the white women, a lot of them you can't name because unfortunately a lot of the really prominent ones, you know, were a part of the split, but a lot of the white women too, I believe the Grimkeys were a part of this, could be wrong. Don't write down Grimkey. Stayed in the group, right? It's about everybody getting a vote, right? And I'm going to show you the Frederick Douglass quote right now. Like, my right to vote doesn't impede yours. So our exit ticket today is an SAQ. So you got two sources. It's all on this topic. And then you got 3 questions. And I'm going to talk about this. Oh man, I love Frederick Douglass. So he says, right, I'm not even going to get into it because it's your exit ticket. In fact, take special care for this exit ticket because I am going to talk about it tomorrow, and I'm going to grade it as its own standalone grade. Let me say that again. Some of you left. Track your friends down. Make sure they know. Your exit tickets are always averaged, right? That's why sometimes on Google Classroom you don't get grades for every single one because I'm just writing them down in my grade book and I'm putting them in PowerSchool. This one will be its own grade. In fact, I'm going to go in and change right now the scale from 20 points to 100 points. Take your time. Take it seriously. I'm going to even extend the time to 6 o'clock from 5 to 5 o'clock. So you have extra time if you're here on campus and you want to go home and do it. But take it seriously, take your time, and answer the SAQ in full format. Because it is a full SAQ, it has 2 sources, and I want you to use it appropriately. It's talking about the arguments Douglass is making, then it's asking about the arguments Gage is making, and then it's asking you to use the information in the sources and talk about the other argument. If you have practice, if it's a little late, if it's not a big deal, don't worry. And you'll have time right now. There's about 5 minutes, and if you don't finish it, I'd rather you take the time to do it carefully and late than not at all. I will start grading them tomorrow after I go over them. So that gives you time to get them into me soon. Get them on time. If it's late, Google Classroom tells me when you submit it late. So if you've submitted it after I've gone over it, you're going to lose major points. Submit it on time. Get it in there. I'll open up the time, and I'll change the grading scale right now. It's a standalone exit ticket. So if there are no more questions, that is all I have for you today.